In this third video on lifestyle modification, I'm going to discuss specifics on comments that I received and questions that I often hear from patients. Some of my patients ask me that they eat very little sugars, how can they be diabetic? Other patients state, I don't understand why my cholesterol is high if I don't eat high-fat foods. So there are specifics amongst diet and exercise that help cardiac patients, but also help patients with endocrinology problems like diabetes. And I'm going to address a few of these issues. As far as diabetes is concerned, diabetes is caused when your pancreas can't make enough insulin to take glucose out of the bloodstream. The most common cause, and this type 2 diabetes is something which is acquired. Type 1 diabetes, people are born with a pancreas that just doesn't make enough insulin. Type 2 diabetes, the pancreas actually makes more insulin than people who don't have diabetes. And what happens is, as you gain weight and you have more fat cells take insulin out of the bloodstream. The body says, wait, I don't have enough insulin, I need more insulin, so the pancreas starts making more insulin and it starts going on overdrive. So the pancreas works harder. The more fat cells you have, fat cells take insulin out of the bloodstream without glucose. So you're stuck with extra blood sugar in your bloodstream, and your pancreas starts making more and more and more insulin. Once the pancreas can't keep up anymore, then that insulin production can't match what the body's need is, then your actual blood sugars start going up. And that's what diabetes is. Once you're diabetic, you have to be very careful with simple sugars, and that's everything from breads or pastas to strawberries or blueberries or grapes. So fruits are great foods to eat in general, but if you have diabetes, you have to be careful with all types of simple sugars. Eating simple sugars, however, doesn't cause diabetes. My diet is about 80% carbs. I exercise on a regular basis and I burn off those carbs, and I need those carbs for the exercise that I do. So having a high carb diet does not cause diabetes. Taking in more calories than you burn off, gaining fat cells, that's what ends up causing diabetes in the first place. So it's not the carbs that do it, and taking in a higher amount of carbs is fine as long as you burn those carbs and you don't have diabetes, because once you do have diabetes, you have to be careful with the carbs. As far as cholesterol, everybody has a genetic start point. So you're born with a gene from your mom and your dad, and that determines how much LDL, which is your good or bad cholesterol, and HDL, which is your good cholesterol, is made by the liver. If we take 100 people off the street that all are the same height, the same weight, do the same amount of exercise, and eat the same foods, they're going to have 100 different cholesterol levels. So everybody has a pre-programmed genetic start point. If my genetic start point for LDL, which is a bad cholesterol, is up here, and another guy who weighs 300 or 400 pounds, his genetic start point is here, he would have been here, but by going up to 300, 400 pounds, his LDL came up here. My start point was very bad, but with great diet and exercise, I brought it down here, but this 400 pound guy may still have a better LDL or bad cholesterol than me because our genetic start points are so much different. So you can't look at somebody and say, oh, he's got high cholesterol, or he's got great cholesterol. The only way of knowing that is to have your cholesterol checked. So if you've never had a cholesterol checked and you're an adult, it's a good idea to have your cholesterol checked at some point. If your LDL is high, the less saturated fat that you eat, the better your LDL is going to be. And you have to look at labels. So people think you could go to restaurants and go to the healthy choice menu. There are many items on healthy choice menus, from fast food places like McDonald's to Cheesecake Factory and other places, that are healthy choice items but have more total fat and saturated fat than some of the regular items that are on the menu. In a lot of these McDonald's, for example, you can look at the PDFs of nutritional information and look at the saturated fat that's within some of these foods, and you'll find very high amounts of saturated fats in some of the salads. Some of those have more than a Big Mac with cheese would. Same thing is true with, bringing up McDonald's, salt. Some of the drinks, like a double chocolate milkshake, has more salt in it than the medium French fries do. So the point of this isn't to bash McDonald's, but the point is to say you have to look at labels. You need to know what you're taking in. Saturated fat is the most important thing when it comes to LDL or bad cholesterol. It's a very small particle, so most of the saturated fat that you eat gets absorbed, and a lot of that gets turned into LDL. People ask about cholesterol and can I have eggs or can I have shellfish? Having some shellfish and eggs is fine. Cholesterol, those are higher foods in cholesterol, but that itself is a bigger particle that's not absorbed as well by the intestinal tract. And as long as you don't have 6 eggs at the same time, and you have 1 egg, a lot of that cholesterol that you eat gets pooped out and not absorbed and doesn't impact the LDL like saturated fat would. So it's important when you're looking at diet and your cholesterol's high, read labels and limit your saturated fat. That's the most important thing you can do for cholesterol. A side note on this is going back to genetic start point. If your genetic start point is very high, there's a good likelihood that other family members have the same high start point. So if you identify yourself as having very high LDL, your blood siblings should at some point have their cholesterol checked. And when you have children, as those children age, or if they get blood tests even at a younger age for some other reason, it's a good idea to have their cholesterol checked. As far as sodium, I brought this up with McDonald's. If you have high blood pressure, patients come to me all the time to say, my blood pressure is high today, but it wasn't high yesterday. When there's variances in blood pressure, that's usually due to either hydration. If you live in a hot climate where you sweat a lot and you're not hydrated enough, or you sweat more than average and you haven't replenished the fluids, your blood pressure is going to be lower because there's less volume in your body. But if you're not changing your hydration, a lot of these variances in blood pressure are related to sodium intake. There's a lot of salt in foods that you wouldn't think contain salt. So if you have a problem with high blood pressure, look at the foods that you're eating and try to limit the salt. If you take in a consistent amount of salt, that will limit some of these spikes in blood pressure. From a physician end, if we see somebody's blood pressure is 180 one day for a top number, which is the systolic, and 100 the next day, it's very difficult to put them on medications to treat that 180, because if we drop that 180 down to 130, we're also going to drop that 100 the previous day down to 60 or 70, and that person's going to get dizzy or lightheaded most likely from being over medicated and dropping the blood pressure too low. But that goes back to the patient end. If you have one very good day where you're not taking in any salt, but another day where you have a higher salt meal, you're going to have a rather large range of blood pressures. Eliminating those higher salt days will make it helpful to keep that range a little bit lower, and also prevent the blood pressure from going up where you would need more medications to bring the blood pressure back down. A lot of patients come back and say, I never add salt to my food. I'll ask them what they ate for dinner, and they said I had a can of soup and a chicken breast, so there really wasn't any salt in there. It is very hard to find canned soups that are low in sodium, and most soups, if you eat a can of soup, will have more salt than a person should take in a given day. If you're looking at specific numbers to follow both for saturated fat and salt, you should never take in more than 2,000 milligrams of sodium a day. If you have a problem with high blood pressure and you can stay under 1,000 milligrams a day, that'd be the best thing to do. As far as saturated fat is concerned, nobody should really take in over 10 grams of saturated fat per day. So even if you don't have cholesterol problems, if you're taking in more than 10 grams of saturated fat in a day, you don't need to take in that much. If you do have problems with cholesterol and you can get yourself under 5 grams of saturated fat in a day, that would be even better. People come back to me sometimes and say, well, I'm vegan, so I really get little saturated fat. The average vegan actually takes in more saturated fat than the non-vegan. And a lot of it's in dressings that they put on the foods. Tahini, for example, which is ground sesame, is a good staple because it also has protein in it. Sesame is good for that, but it's also very high in saturated fat. Patients say, well, I only use coconut oil. Coconut oil shouldn't be on the market. It's terrible. Coconut oil is almost identical to when we grew up and your mom had this big jar of Crisco. That's pure lard. Coconut oil is almost pure saturated fat, and it's terrible. You can have very little coconut oil and have your entire day saturated fat just in a little bit of coconut oil. Avocados are marketed as the healthy fruit. One avocado on average has 3.1 grams of saturated fat. And I'm not saying avocados are terrible things to eat, but they are high in saturated fat. That's the only fruit that has a significant source of saturated fat in it. So you don't only find saturated fat in meat or meat products. You'll find it in many products, which is why I go back to looking at labels. You have to look at labels, look to see what you're eating, and if you're careful with the foods that you need to watch out for, you're going to improve your overall health.